For more on this story, we can bring in former federal and state prosecutor Eric Lisan, who joins us from Washington. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Why has it taken this long for Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest to come? Because for years, countless women have accused her of complicity.
Yes, the case has an extremely complicated history. And as you may have touched upon, originally there was an agreement with federal prosecutors in Florida that the case, at least as directed by those prosecutors, would not proceed against either Epstein or any of his co-conspirators, which would include Maxwell, who is one of his closest, if not the closest co-conspirator. However, that agreement did not bind or limit other federal prosecutors' offices outside of that particular one in the Southern District of Florida. And eventually, over time, enough attention was brought to the case and enough deliberations were brought within the overall Department of Justice that the Southern District of New York, where a lot of the criminal activity or alleged criminal activity took place, decided that it would bring its own prosecution without having to be limited by the agreement made in the Southern District of Florida. That's what brought the case almost a year ago against Epstein, and then, of course, he famously or infamously died while in federal custody, and that complicated things as well. The case against Maxwell was further complicated because she was outside the United States, most likely, and the investigation was still ongoing. Now, what it turns out happened was that sometime over the past year, presumably, there was an indictment placed under seal with charges against her. And when she was arrested this morning, when she was easily within the jurisdiction of federal authorities, that indictment and those charges were unsealed. So it's been a long and complicated process, but the charges were there. Federal prosecutors in New York were always looking into the case, and now we see the beginning of the public proceedings involving her.
You know, Jeffrey Epstein was a billionaire. He rubbed shoulders with presidents and princes. Clearly, prosecutors want to get Ghislaine Maxwell to talk, don't they?
Yes, she's probably the single most important witness that they could have, with the possible exception of Epstein himself, but in some ways more valuable than Epstein himself, because she might be less conflicted, not have quite as many entanglements as he have, and might be able to provide a somewhat more easily corroboratable account of things. So many people, of course, that may be involved in this may be nervous right now if they feel that they had dealings with her that she might know about, and that she might be willing to truthfully cooperate with federal authorities. But there's still a lot of unknowns about all this. We don't know exactly what she knows, and we don't know exactly if she'd be willing to divulge that.
Indeed. And now, you know, you mentioned this in your previous answer where you said Jeffrey Epstein, you know, famously took his own life while in prison. You know, some doubts remain over the peculiar realities of how he died in jail. But will Ghislaine Maxwell get justice?
Well, she and her attorneys will negotiate with the federal authorities about the best way in everybody's interest to resolve these criminal charges. It does seem like they have what the prosecutors believe is a serious and fairly solid case against her, or they would not have filed it the way they did. They would not have arrested her without having, in their opinion, substantial backup, which they're, in terms of evidence, which they're required to have under internal department guidelines. So then the question becomes, are they willing to work with Maxwell as a witness if she is willing to work? And can they reach an agreement under conditions that would be satisfactory to her? The typical case is one in which her own criminal sentence would be limited in some way. And if they can reach an agreement on that and they find that her testimony can be corroborated, she would be very valuable. But they have to strike the right balance in finding a solution that also imposes a sentence on her. They're not required to strike any deal. If they find that it's not worth it to do so in terms of reducing her sentence, or if what she has to say is really not all that valuable,
we'll see what happens.
Go ahead and prosecute to the full extent of these charges.
Indeed. We'll see what happens. Eric, thank you very much for joining us on the program this evening. In other news, the U.S.